Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Oguzhan Atay, co-founder and CEO of BillionToOne. BillionToOne is a precision diagnostics company that quantifies biology to create powerful molecular diagnostics. They work to improve disease detection by counting molecules with their proprietary molecular counting platform. They place patients at the forefront of everything they do and are currently applying their proprietary technology to non-invasive prenatal screening and liquid biopsy. Oguzhan holds a Ph.D. from Stanford in systems biology, where he implemented machine learning algorithms and mathematical models to solve specific problems in cellular biology, and developed a data-driven mathematical framework to simplify the analysis of complex biological networks. He also has a degree in molecular biology from Princeton, as well as minors in computer science, physics, and applied mathematics. Oguzhan not only combines deep technical expertise with visionary leadership, but he also has an incredibly inspirational immigrant journey, which makes this series a must-listen for first-time founders, scientists, and industry leaders alike. Over the next 2 episodes, we'll dive into Oguzhan's inspiring journey, covering his path from a small Turkish town to becoming a biotech entrepreneur, how his scientific passion, nurtured by his parents and honed at Princeton, flourished during his Ph.D. research at Stanford, and why Oguzhan's multidisciplinary approach, combined with his rigorous Turkish academic system that prepared him for global challenges, ultimately led him to found BillionToOne, which aims to revolutionize access to molecular diagnostics worldwide. Today, we'll discuss Oguzhan's small-town upbringing in Turkey, where his parents' resilience and commitment to education sparked his passion for science. We'll also dive into his academic journey from Turkey to Princeton, where he embraced an interdisciplinary approach and discovered how blending diverse fields could lead to groundbreaking discoveries. Finally, we'll explore how Turkey's highly competitive academic system shaped his mindset and prepared him for the challenges he would face on the global stage. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast.
Oguzhan, so good to see you again. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So as we were finding a kind of a interesting place to start, we with our podcast, our traditional kind of intro is to go all the way back to the early days and really learn about your upbringing, and how it influenced your leadership style, your business philosophy, and how you ultimately got interested in science. So can you take us all the way back? Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, I grew up in a small town in Turkey. So in the Black Sea region, around 50 to 100,000 population. So it's kind of a conservative little town. To middle income, parents, but both very educated. My father is a medical doctor. My mother is a teacher. My mother actually is retired now, but I've always in my family, it is impossible to not graduate from college. Like, it's kind of a given that every person who would be born to that family, will go to college. But I think it was also important, in terms of what my parents have gone through to go to college themselves. So I think this is also the expectation, because they had to go through so much hardship to be able to even get educated in elementary school, let alone going to college, that having had more resources, which actually is like not that many resources compared to, I think, what people would see in the US. It was a foregone conclusion that I would go to higher education. I would do college, and it was always so important in my family that that we cared about education so much. But again, I also knew what my father had to go through to be able to get educated. He grew up in a little village, close to my hometown, but his father was deployed in terms of military service to other places, so he was in this very large family. There wasn't even enough food for them to eat, and his uncle would even sometimes beat him for using the gas oil too much for
Oh
studying.
boy. Yeah.
And he would have to walk 5 miles to go to school, like in snow. It's like really kind of
Real.
like real hardship, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
even to this day, he is just the fastest person that I've ever seen in terms of eating food, because like for him, it was like a matter of survival that like if
Yeah.
you could eat faster, it wasn't that there were, plates for everyone. It was like, just one giant, um, the pot from which like everyone was eating, and the faster that you could eat, you would be able to get a little bit more calories. So, really, a lot of hardship that they had to go through to, get educated, and, being middle income, like we had, a lot more resources in terms of a lot more support and being able to go through education. So, education was always important in my family. But even then, I think like I've always been, so curious that, I would even read everything that I could find, from encyclopedias to, you know, like newspapers, anything really that I could find, sometimes multiple times. I remember distinctly that, um, we didn't have enough money to buy a lot of books. Again, you are in Turkey, it is a developing country. So I would read the books that we would get from this one little bookstore that we had in the entire, city that I was living in. And he was a friend of my father, so he would actually give me the books. I would read them very carefully, and we would return them, and I would get more books. We would pay for the books once, right? We,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
pay like for the first set.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then, we wouldn't have to pay for, replacing and changing them. And yeah, so but at least like I was able to, read a lot of books, and, from very early on, I was very into science. And I think I was only 10 years old, going to third grade, that like I decided that I would become a scientist and I would
Oh
study
wow.
biology.
Wow. Third grade. That's like the opposite of my experience. I was like, what do I do? I'm like, I don't know. I'm gonna just figure this out. I'm like feeling my way. And when you were in third grade, were you still in Turkey at that time? Or
Yes,
okay.
yes. I came to United States for my undergrad education. So I've been in Turkey, up until undergrad. I went to a very good high school in Istanbul. It was a boarding school. So up to high school, I was in this little hometown, kind of trying to read everything that I can find. Turkish education system is also very highly test driven. It's a little bit like I think some of the, I think Chinese Indian systems are a little bit like that too. But starting with really third grade, you start getting ranked multiple times in a year, like in the region,
Oh,
sometimes nationally. So there is a
oh,
lot of like competition, and
yeah.
you know that where you are ranked. So I think some of the competitive drive is coming from essentially like, that time where,
Yeah.
starting from third grade all the way to, getting into college, you are going through these like multiple choice exams where, you are like trying to, beat everyone else. You are trying to essentially get, ranked as high as you can. It determines like what college that you can get into, as well as like what major that you can choose. So it really
Mm.
determines kind of your life trajectory to do
Yeah.
well in these exams. So I've always been kind of like very competitive in in those exams, and at the end of the day, like it didn't matter for me because I got into a college in the United States, but that I think really you know shaped how I look at the world a little bit. That I think that it probably contributed to how competitive I am as well.
I'm gonna imagine, like, I mean, that's a pretty early, like, kind of tracking. Like, you're just like, okay, like, this is gonna determine many years of my life. Like, I need to stick the landing here. Um, And when you were picking, you mentioned that this is almost like what you can major in. Was there kind of like, obviously it sounds like you found science as to be the North Star for you. Was there any kind of like, did your parents ever like try to nudge you into a different direction for different types of kind of majors or professions? Or was it kind of a thing where they're like, as long as you are doing your best here, you can choose your own adventure?
Yeah, I think it's really the latter. They have been extremely supportive in general. Again, as long as you are doing your absolute best.
Yeah.
And this was a little bit different between myself and my sister as well, right? Like our bests were a little bit different. And so, in her case, like they never pushed her to be number one because like that wasn't um, like what she would be striving towards. But in my case, like I would get ranked number one, number one, number one, like three times, in the same year, and I would get ranked number two, in the entire region. And my father would be like, "Did you really try your best?" And like it would be the most devastating thing
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you could say.
Like, what about my sister? Like, she's not getting. Like, she has it way easier than I do. Like, I'm gonna go
But
hang out.
I think it was like, again, like it wasn't even like, why are you number two? It was like, did you try your best? And like,
Yeah.
and knew that like I didn't. Like it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
essentially that you get complacent. And I think like
Yeah.
I learned not to get complacent when I was a
Yeah.
10-year-old. Like you
Yeah, yeah,
can't you
yeah,
can't
yeah,
be like, oh, like, I know everything. Like if you approach things that way, like you are going to make mistakes and you are going to go down in the rankings. But again, I think as a 10-year-old, that is a lot of pressure, to be honest.
for sure, for sure. And so now it sounds like you're acing these exams, and it's time for you to choose the university that you were going to. Put us back into that mind state, that moment in time. What were you thinking? Did you always know that you were going to go to the United States? Did you always know that Princeton was the ultimate goal? Kind of walk us through that.
Yeah. So, you know, when I went to that boarding school in Istanbul, I was thinking that I would go to a university in Turkey. It wasn't that I was planning immediately go to the United States. I knew that I wanted to do at least do my PhD in the United States because, molecular biology is an experimental science, and in a developing country, you are not going to get best resources to be able to really do the cutting edge research in many areas. So, I knew about, Stanford, Princeton, some of these universities and how they are really deriving, some of the cutting edge research. So I knew that like I would come to the United States for my PhD, but not necessarily undergrad. I didn't even know that that was an option. So going into this boarding high school, which again, I actually entered with a national exam by getting, ranked very
Yeah,
highly, and I got
yeah.
a full scholarship to this school as well. And that actually process was one of the most challenging things that have ever happened to me in my career, that I didn't know English, and all these teachers in this boarding, elite high school, like the education was in English. So it's the first time that I actually found myself challenged because, the problems themselves are not difficult. It's just I
Yeah.
didn't understand them.
Yeah.
Uh, so, that was a very, very difficult time. But, I stuck with it. It was, challenging to go to a place where like you don't speak the language and you find yourself no longer number one because you don't understand the question.
Yeah.
But I learned English in that first year, and then I graduated as valedictorian of that school, and that school is, I think, so rigorous and so highly thought of that we had the head of admissions from Yale actually came and sat in my class and like
Oh,
took my name like after that class, and I joked.
whoa.
I joked throughout the year that like Yale is my safety school now.
Yeah.
Um,
Holy
yeah,
crap.
but like it is a really, really strong high school. It's like, one of the best high schools in Turkey. The the rigor is actually just amazing. And being in that school and kind of seeing that people can easily get into Ivy League, from Turkey directly for undergrad, I think that is when, my thought process changed that, I want to go to United States, for my undergrad, once I saw that that was a possibility there. Um, but, the, um, I still actually, took the national exam because, I was like, okay, I prepared,
Yep.
my entire life for that moment,
Yeah. Yeah.
even though it is not going to, impact my, college choice. I still, took the exam, but I came to the United States for my undergrad because I thought that, especially in an experimental science like molecular biology, I would have a lot more resources and I would be able to really start working with the professors that I dreamed working with.
That's amazing. And it reminds me of like uh, I, I'm a fan of basketball, but like when NBA recruiters will go to go to like the disparate corners of like all over the world looking for talent. And like the Yale recruiters, like we're going there. Like they've got like this pool of talent that we need to tap into. Um, that's super awesome. And so when you got to Princeton, and you sounds like you already had a feeling that molecular biology was going to be, what you're majoring in. Talk a little bit about, did you have a undergraduate lab experience like out the gate?
Yes. So, because, that was the reason that, I am coming all the way to the United States, I wanted to take full advantage of it and take full advantage of, undergrad education in general. And, I like pushing myself, but, undergrad experience at Princeton really gave me the, best opportunities to be able to do that. I actually took, the most difficult courses, not just in, molecular biology, but, in even fields that are completely different from mine. Like I took the most difficult courses in, operations research, in engineering, in mathematics, in physics, in even Russian literature, believe
That's
it or not.
awesome.
And that was a really great experience. And actually, the first quarter, the first semester that I was at Princeton, I started with usual curriculum that they recommend, and after about 1.5 weeks, I dropped every single class that I was taking. I was like, I didn't come to Princeton like for this because, again, having come from such a rigorous high school, and it was an international baccalaureate program. Um, the, you know, my, expectation was that, I need to be challenging myself if I am going to be away from my country, away from, my parents. It was just that, if I'm going to go through this, difficult experience in general, and, college is, I think, difficult for, everyone, but it is particularly difficult, if it is a completely different culture that you are
Yeah.
putting yourselves into. I was like, it needs to have it needs to be worth it. So that is why I started actually my undergraduate research. I think like the um, my first year in the second semester,
Sweet.
I started already doing research in a lab, and I worked in that lab, throughout my undergraduate education. And we have done some really cool experiments there, and I learned a lot.
That's awesome. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience? Whose lab were you in and like what were you doing?
Yeah, so I was in the lab of late Jack Fresco. He passed away a couple of years ago, but and he essentially was looking at essentially DNA structure. There are a lot of different things that we still don't know about DNA structure. There is like third strand binding that you can use. Um, there are, you can have actually, if you have a lot of telomeres actually have like these, fourth strand structures. So there is a lot of like, interesting chemistry and molecular biology that happens in that intersection. And it was, really fascinating to work with him as well, because it is part of it is predictable, the chemistry part, but part of it requires experimental approaches, and he's a he has seen everything. He has been one of the really the originators of molecular biology field. He was he knew Max Delbruck, like a lot of the people who really started this entire revolution. Like he communicated with Linus Pauling. Like he had all these amazing stories about teaching biology to Oppenheimer.
Yeah, it's so crazy.
So it was really amazing to be in his lab, because the sciences, it was interesting, but you could also get kind of a history lesson about history of science and history of biology. And he was telling me about how he made fun of Pauling about getting the DNA structure wrong. And
That's so crazy. I was thinking back on my experience in Berkeley, and someone had a Linus Pauling story. I think in his later years, he was really into vitamin C, and would just take scoops, big scoops of vitamin C, and just eat it.
Yeah,
and just eat it.
I think that is one of those things where people can be brilliant in one particular area that doesn't always translate to an expertise in another area. This sometimes happens with relatives, or my mother, and they would see a news and they would be like, look, this very accomplished person is saying this thing, and I'm like, well, are they accomplished in that particular area? Because they may be brilliant, but being brilliant in one area does not always necessarily translate to being brilliant in another area.
Absolutely. And I left out one part of that story, but basically they said that when he would eat the vitamin C, he would take a swig of vodka and just wink to wash it down. I was just like, yep, that's a choice. That's a choice. But that's awesome that you're in you're in a lab that had a storied history, and I can imagine you're it's almost like celebrity, starstruck. You're like, holy crap. And so it sounds like, and also I love that you're maximizing your time at Princeton. I look back and I'm like, man, there were so many things, so much more I could have done. I could have jam packed this, and I love to hear that you actually took that. You really took that opportunity and seized it. And I know you also minored in computer science, physics, applied mathematics. Was there, can you talk a little bit about those experiences, and I guess how did each kind of change your perspective or the way you approach problems?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really the crux of what we do at BillionToOne as well, and really how we are approaching molecular diagnostics differently. And it's not just my idea. In fact, Princeton has this integrated science program that is just truly remarkable in bridging different areas of science. So much so that I was actually disappointed after Princeton, because I thought that was how science was done. That was my, thinking about okay, this is what science is, and it's not. It is actually this, little bubble where there's, remarkable research that is happening, really interesting research that really bridges those different areas. And you can see how an idea from a particular field can completely change another field, and how you can use physics principles, mathematical principles to inform how you are approaching biology problems. It was an amazing experience, and it's a very rigorous program. Half of the people who started drop out. So it's a tough program, but it is taught by really the most amazing figures in molecular biology, and you can really understand how these disciplines interact with each other. So going through, that integrated science program and approaching, biological problems from, physics and mathematical and computational principles, essentially what I did was, because I was trying to push myself, I would not just take the integrated science program courses, but then I would go and like take, essentially, push myself to learn more about those other disciplines. And essentially they ended up being like minors. And
Cool.
Princeton doesn't, allow you to double major or triple major. So, each of those things ended up being, minors for me. But really it was about trying to learn as much about those different disciplines as possible so that I can bring those, principles, tools, approaches back to molecular biology. And again, like it really is, what integrated science is about, systems biology is about. But it is not how, in general, molecular biology is
Yep.
done, unfortunately. So, one of the cool things about integrated science, and I hope it is still the same way, that you could actually bring any books to the exams as you want. Like, can you imagine in a
Yeah.
biology course
No.
that is allowed? Because they
No.
wouldn't ask you to like, they wouldn't ask you some memorization, question. All the, courses, exams, problem sets were things that you couldn't find in books. It would be something like, here is the rate of blood flow in veins, and essentially using Navier-Stokes theorem to calculate that flow if someone had a blockage where the radius is decreased by 40%. So kind of like trying to approach those problems, you could either computationally model it, you could try to use a physics problem to solve it,
Yeah.
and you would always like learn something fundamental about biology by solving that problem, but it was never about, memorize this fact and kind of be able to regurgitate, back to the, back to a question. So it was kind of a really, uh, I think, different biology experience than, most people who major in biology go through. And that kind of really set the stage for my PhD, how I approach my PhD, but even more importantly, how we approach to creating BillionToOne and how we approach problems here, which we have really a much more of a design-based approach where we actually know a lot of the times, like 90+% of the time before we do the experiment, before we actually design the assay, how well that design is going to work.
That's amazing. And I feel the same way about like kind of like stretching yourself to go experience and get exposure to different disciplines and then taking it back. And it could be biology, it could be business, but like there's so much value in it's just like critical thinking and different like approaches. And I studied a lot of philosophy when I was at Berkeley, and philosophy has like there's like it has like ties to like rhetoric and also the like, computer science, like logic and type of stuff. And I still find myself like thinking back to like that kind of like philosophical like basically rigor and thinking through problems that I encounter like in business today. And I'm so grateful for like it was probably I got to give Berkeley their flowers because they know that you can easily just like do like your major and not branch out. So in the very beginning, they're like, you have to take like you have to go into these departments and like take these courses that are not your core. And I ended up finding like, oh, like philosophy is like it's really fun and like really interesting and like it's super helpful, in like problem solving today. So I love hearing like you being able to kind of like piece that together and bring it back to molecular biology. And I know kind of around this time you ended up at the University of Oxford as well. Was this kind of like in that same kind of time period?
So Princeton in junior year has this really cool program where one person from Oxford takes your place at Princeton and you
Oh,
their place.
and they
It's
swap.
actually it's like a true exchange.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and and because of the way that my kind of program was working out, I could really go there and only do research. And I was like, this is great. I can spend the next 5 months only doing research in a different environment, learning about a different school of thought. And it was a great experience because Oxford is very different, right? They get specialized very early. It is a very different type of approach. There are certain things that I like there as well. I did take like one physics course there, and the nice thing there was that you spent a lot more time, I think, um, with the faculty. I mean, usually these are the fellows, but it is kind of a much smaller environment. It was really like 2, 3 students with
Oh,
one
wow.
fellow discussing some of the problems, and you could get into a lot of deeper tangential points. So there were nice things about the experience, but it did uh, I think give me a little bit of an understanding of why US research is, farther ahead than other places. But one thing that I appreciated, at Oxford was how well that they use their resources. Like in the US, when you design an experiment, it's kind of like, okay, like this is the question, we design it, go, go, go. And that like your first one or second or sometimes the third try is not going to be usable. Whereas there, they design it so meticulously. They think about it, they make sure that like every control is in the right place, and
Yeah.
and then like they run it. So in terms of the sheer amount of work, like in the US, we are working a lot more. They don't work, I think, as hard. Work-life balance is so much better, even at Oxford. In terms of actual output, I think like US is still higher because like there is no uh, shortcut to really really hard work, and US has more resources as well. But I think UK and Oxford gets does a very good job because in terms of like if you look at the productivity of experiments, you know they are at least like 2x better. It's just that
Oh,
in the
wow.
US, like we do 4x more experiments.
Got it.
It
Yep.
ends
Yep.
up being kind of like winning in terms of just brute force.
Yeah, brute force. There's a sheer volume,
Yeah.
and I've heard like if for grad programs in the at Oxford or like in the UK in general too, they have a very strict time. Like
Mhm.
you like it's like you have X amount of years and you got to finish it. There's
Yeah.
no extension to this. So they're probably
Yes.
like, all right, we need to we need
Mhm.
to make sure this is being done efficiently and on time.
Yeah. Yeah. There is no like, even in PhD programs, like the first year at Stanford for my PhD, it's all exploration. They don't even let you join a lab. Like they're like, okay, like you need to go, spend a few months in, 3, 4 different labs, find the thing that you are very passionate about and, work on that. Whereas, day one at Oxford, you need to become productive so that you can graduate, in 3 years. 3 years is a very short time to do a
Yeah.
PhD. In most PhD programs in the US, by your third year, like you still haven't accomplished much.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's a very different environment. Each has, I think, its pros and cons. Um, if you want to stay in academia, I think like US is probably the better choice because it really forces you to produce enough before you can graduate. Um, and I know some very rigorous PIs. Like one of them, for instance, very nice person, like one of the nicest people that I've ever met. Very strong scientist. Actually, he's a Nobel laureate, and he would not graduate people. I think the shortest that anyone could graduate was like 7 years. There are people who stayed like in the lab like for 9 years because very rigorous. So you would be
Yeah.
like, okay, like you need to complete, this very much like every avenue and make sure that your conclusions are correct. And then we publish that in a high impact journal. And then, you are ready for the world, as a scientist. So, and I think it's very important to choose the right PI because even though I love him. I don't think I would be happy, spending, 7 to 9 years
Yeah.
doing my PhD.
Yeah, that's a long time. The and so now, like, you spent time in the UK. You've kind of have a feel. You've gotten a good lab experience at Princeton, so you know kind of what the US kind of lab culture is like. And it sounds like you're in an awesome lab. How did it sounds like, academia and further graduate studies was, on the horizon. How did you come to select Stanford? And how did you select your PI or the lab you're going to be in?
So Stanford was, I think, a combination of factors. I think Stanford does really great research, and there is very interesting research happening at Stanford. But I only applied to a few schools for my PhD because I had such a strong undergrad research experience that I knew that I would be able to get into essentially everywhere, especially with the support of my very well-known PI.
Yep.
So, I knew that, okay, like, I will have options, and, I applied to really, I also, because I've been spending so much time in research, like I knew what types of research that I liked. So I didn't even really apply to schools as much as apply to, various PIs. I actually reached out to them in advance of the application process to ask, like, are you even accepting students? Because, like, if you are not, I'm not even going to apply.
Yeah.
So, I think from that perspective, I got into, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, but it was really this, specific, PIs that like I was, focusing on. And I think it was like very close between Harvard and Stanford for me. But those two PIs actually had worked with each other. Well,
Yeah.
but it was just that, when I visited Boston, it was, under 2 feet of snow. It was
Yeah.
actually like, my like flight got canceled, the
Yeah.
train, got delayed. It was like
Yeah.
difficult to even go
Yeah.
to that weekend, admit weekend. And, I went to Stanford with this like giant coat, and I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, like this is
This
like
is
kind of, this is what I like.
Yeah,
Because
this is
I come from a
nice.
Mediterranean,
Yeah.
weather. So, coming to Stanford, I was like, okay, I'm like so much happier.
Yeah. I was gonna ask you that. Because I was like also contrasting that to being in the UK, which I'm gonna guess it was like the opposite of that Stanford kind of experience.
Well, I mean, I think like I slightly preferred UK even to Princeton, because one thing that like I found very difficult to get used to on the East Coast was that it would be sunny, and I would think that, okay, like, it's great weather, and it would be freezing. And like I could never get used to that because
Yeah.
coming from, Turkey, when it is sunny, it's warm. Like you don't
Yeah.
expect it to be so cold when it
Yeah.
is sunny. Um, so like I didn't mind UK as much because it doesn't get that cold. Whereas like,
Yeah, it's kind of like
like yeah, Princeton, New
moderate.
York, like gets very, very cold, and I'm not used to like
Yeah.
that level of cold.
Yeah.
So, I could, essentially I was like, okay, do I want to spend another, 5+ years, in Boston, versus, Bay Area? And again, the research and, institutions were both, I think, very attractive. I liked, it wasn't even like just one PI. I liked a few PIs in both of the places that I could see myself working with. So, seeing that the science side was essentially equal, I thought that I would rather be happy.
Yeah, yeah. It's sometimes you have to do it for you. Like you have to you got to think about your wellness. You like,
Yeah.
and it sounds like you felt more like home
Well,
in
one of my
California.
professors at Princeton actually advised me the reverse of this, because he was like, look, when you are doing science, you don't want to like be in such a nice environment. Going
Yeah,
to You're
You'll
not going
lose.
to, you're not going to focus on your science. You are going to have like all these distractions.
Yeah. You'll
Um,
lose your edge. You'll lose the focus.
So, but I was like, okay, like I really, really like the Stanford area. I like the professors, and Stanford also gave me a nice fellowship to start it with. So all of those things, made that decision easier. Again, at that time, I'm not thinking about entrepreneurship. I'm not thinking about, starting a company. So it ended up being a huge component of, even starting BillionToOne, because I don't think I would have started the company if I were in Boston. Because I don't think you have, even though, Boston has a good entrepreneurial scene, it's not at the same level of Stanford, where you are surrounded by so many people thinking about, company formation. There are courses, there are influential thinkers, and it kind of enables you to start thinking about how you can make actually a potentially larger impact through building a company as opposed to through just science. So, and the PIs are very supportive in general as well. So, when you combine all of those things, I think I'm very lucky. I'm very fortunate that, that decision ended up being that way. If I were to go back, I would come to Stanford because of, that particular translational research aspect. But at that time, I think, the honest answer is that I made the decision based on the weather.
Yeah. I love that. Only in like when you look backwards, you can like kind of like connect the dots and you're like, oh, it was just because it was warm. Like,
Oh yeah, I
but
mean, look, I knew that I was making the decision
yeah,
because it was warm and I would be
yeah,
happier. And that is, kind of the honest answer there.
yeah.
The, the kind of better sounding answer is like,
Oh yeah. When you're looking
entrepreneurship,
backwards,
like,
yeah, it was for entrepreneurship the whole time. Yeah. This
yeah.
is like, yeah. This was just like the roadmap on
I
to
like I
doing.
knew that like this is
Yeah.
a
Yeah. Exactly. Sorry, the opposite of it. That's amazing. And so you touched down. You're at Stanford. Talk a little bit about the lab that you're in, the PI that you ended up, choosing to work with. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I started working with actually a couple of PIs, but ended up working most closely with Jan Schottheim. And Schottheim lab works on cell cycle control. And it's not really the problem itself. I think problem itself is very interesting, but it is actually the approach that they take that I think made me a very good fit there. Jan comes from a more of a mathematical background as well, kind of having learned biology actually later on in his career. And I was co-advised by Daniel Fisher, and Daniel comes from a physics background, having learned biology later on as well. So, both of those PIs are very interdisciplinary. They approach problems from a much more integrated science perspective. In those labs, you solve problems by computational modeling, mathematical modeling. You think about the first principles. And Jan is both Jan and Daniel Fisher are, they are truly great thinkers, and they would spend a lot of time with you as well. So
Awesome.
I remember, actually learning information theory, like along with Jan. Like we literally
Yeah.
went through, I think, 31-hour videos together, like discussing, various applications of like, information theory and, how intersects with biology. And actually at the end of the day, like we decided that, well, we don't think this is actually a very useful framework for, a lot of the things. Like it sounds very good, but it
Yeah.
is not like a lot of the applications or kind of using information theory in biology just essentially allows you to get into a potentially high impact journal without really changing the biological insight. So
Yeah.
I think that rigor was there as well, that even though we spent so much time on this, we realized that maybe that is not the thing that we want to focus on because even though I think it is very cool to think about, biological systems in terms of information theory and, signal transduction and all of that, it doesn't really help you get to a better insight than you would otherwise be able to get to. So, and again, I think, it was a really great experience to spend so much time, thinking about those, very novel problems, even though at the end we said that, okay, let's, set it aside and actually, work on more of a biologically meaningful problem and, try to solve something about the, how the cell is making the decision to divide, especially in the context of the mitogen, MAPK pathway, where you are getting conflicting signals, as a cell, and how do you make the decision, one way or another. So it was, a lot of single cell, microfluidics experiments, fluorescence microscopy, a lot of writing code, a lot of single cell analyses, and we had really cool papers that we were able to publish. One of my thesis publication essentially was on the cover of Cell Systems, and it was a kind of really great experience. But towards the end, I also saw that even if you are doing really really cool research, the number of people who is going to read that research is going to be quite small, and I was able to also see at the same time this cell-free DNA revolution that is happening. And if we bring, these types of approaches to cell-free DNA testing, that we could really expand what is possible with that, expand it to other conditions, expand it to conditions that are important in globally. And that was kind of how the thinking has, started around, essentially, it wasn't about building a company. It was really about, how can we solve some of these problems in molecular diagnostics. I knew that I had to build a company, but, I didn't think that like I would have to hire 500 employees to do so at that time. It was really about, okay, like if we are going to build a company and, solve these clinical problems, we need to build a company. Like it's a byproduct of what you are trying to do. But I realized that is where I could make a larger impact than the research setting that I enjoyed a lot doing that. But I also realized that the impact is not today. Impact is 50, 100 years from now. And I wanted to see the impact of my work, I think, a little bit closer to my lifetime.
Absolutely, absolutely. And something that stands out to me about when you were doing the exploration into information theory and how it's like it may or may not have applications or usefulness, and the willingness to just like do the work and then not get that sunk cost kind of like fallacy where like we need to see this through and just like be willing to let it go. I think that's like even outside of academia in business too, that's like a lesson that anyone can really take home, is that even though it looks shiny, cool, and would be really rad to like that it would work together, if it doesn't get you to ultimately whatever that insight, the ultimate like biological insight, then perhaps it's just put it to the side for a moment and reallocate your focus. Because I think a lot of the time I struggle with this is with I just get so invested. I'm just so invested in whatever project or initiative, and I'm like, I cannot see this. Like, I need to see it through. When in reality, probably the most optimal decision is to just like put it aside, because like you only have so much time and so much resource to like focus on anything.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of, I think in terms of business, like that is a very difficult balance, right? You don't want to kind of pivot all the time. I think it's important to have a path and kind of really execute in that path. But you also need to know when something is not working and it's not going to work. It's not just, and I think, a lot of the resilience that founders need, I think, is really something that, I think I gained during my PhD. There was a period of my PhD where for about 6 to 9 months, every single night, sometimes weekends, I would go to the lab because that is when the microscope would be available.
Yeah.
I would set up
Yeah.
the time lapse experiment. Like, I would be there from 11 a.m. to usually like 11 p.m. to like around 1:30 a.m., 1 a.m., setting up the experiment. And then, half the time I would come back in the morning and, it would have crashed, and
Yeah.
wasted work. You would
Yeah.
go the next day and, you would repeat that experiment. And the killer was that after about 6 to 9 months, I found in the data that everything that I was looking at analyzing for the past 9 months, like going into the lab during the day, analyzing the data at night, analyzing the data during the day, I found that all of that work was just looking at autofluorescence. And that the thing is, the signal was such that it was exactly as you would expect. Because what was happening is that I was changing the external conditions to look at the intensity of a particular protein that we tagged with the green fluorescent protein, so that what we expected was what we were seeing. So, and I kept doing different experiments around this, changing the conditions, doing increasing the and decreasing it, and it was always like what you would expect from the theory, that this is what you need to see. It turns out that for whatever reason, and one of my professors at Princeton used to say that proteins are magic. GFP was not fluorescing when it was tagged to that particular protein. And I was
Oh.
just seeing the change in autofluorescence that was
Oh.
happening due to the environmental change.
Oh.
So, I mean, it was a crushing feeling, right? Like, you
Yeah.
spend 9 months, like, working, 70 hours a week, and you find out that this is actually not real. But it is also a relief, because
Yeah.
you don't want to publish that. Like, you
Yeah.
don't want to be
No.
the person that published the wrong data, wrong conclusion. um, and I started from scratch. Like, I was like, okay, this 9 months, it's complete trash. Like, let's
Yeah.
move on. Like, we
Yeah.
will, we will, reclone the GFP to this protein with different linkers, and we'll make sure that this doesn't happen again. With and I did that, and experiments worked, and we repeated 9 months of work. And that ended up being my thesis work.
There we go.
But I think, like, it shows that kind of resilience, right? I think those bad things happen when you are building a company as well. Ups and downs, it's every day. And being able to just say, okay, this didn't work. What is next is very important.
Absolutely. And I think that is I think it is not talked about enough. It's just kind of like how important what you just highlighted, like this mentality to be able to just like get like punched in the teeth, like, and then being willing to start from scratch and start anew. Because I think it's, and that element, when you're at that kind of like crossroads, sometimes that's like a lot. I just observe as an observer, like a lot of companies just shut down because they say it's a wrap. Like I don't have another one in me. Like I don't have another one. And then like you said, but if you choose to get back and just do it again and not give up, and I know that sounds like contrived and like not, it kind of maybe fluffy, but it's like it's
Not
super
contract.
important. Yeah.
But it is every day. Like, I mean, I even talk about this with our sales team. When we have new hire sales training, I tell them about, early days of the company. Just as we kind of solved the problem and we were like, okay, this is great. Now, like, we are getting sales in. That is when COVID happened. Every clinic, like, essentially it was impossible to get into any physician clinics to be able to sell them on the tests that we were selling. And if you are not growing, you are dead as a startup. And we had to get very creative. We could have said, well, who can predict and prepare for a global pandemic? I don't have any options. Like we never took kind of that victim mentality. We said that we are not victims. We are going to figure out a problem. And at that time, just as an example, I have like 10 stories like this where we saved the company.
Yeah.
And okay, what can we do? And we realized that okay, there is not much that we can do, but we had two problems. One, we had a product problem because we were asking people to split their labs and send one portion of the prenatal labs to us and another to a competitor. And we said that okay, like this already is a struggle in the current market with COVID. This is going to completely kill us unless we fix this. So we essentially told the R&D team, we have to launch this in the next 3 to 4 months. Do whatever it takes, like even if it means that we are going to have a high no-call rate, because we never want to give the wrong result, but you can give a no-call when you don't have enough evidence. Even if you have to have a high no-call rate, even if the cost of running this is a little bit high, whatever you need, we need to get this to launch, right? And they said, okay, like let's get to work. Another small team, we said, okay, we need to keep our current lab open. And the only way that it is going to be possible is if we test people with COVID-19 tests. But there are no COVID-19 tests available. So we told them, we need to build our own COVID-19 test, yes, diagnostic lab. So we actually built a test that we used on our employees like twice a week. Like all of our employees throughout the pandemic, like throughout the first like 2.5 years or so, 2 years. And that is how we stayed open, because we like if we had one person who gets infected, like we would have to shut down. So we're like, okay, we have to like test everyone like twice a week.
Holy
And then the third
moly.
part was we need to get into these clinics. How are we going to be able to get in front of these physicians? And we realized, okay, we can't get into the clinic, but how can we get them out of the clinic? So at that time that even the US government didn't have N95 masks and hand sanitizers, we were able to get those from China. It was like a smuggling operation. Like we were awake like at midnight, like trying to get things through customs. Things weren't even like labeled because it would be held in customs if they were like, labeled. Like we had to put the labels ourselves to hand sanitizers.
Oh my
They
God.
came in like unlabeled, boxes.
Yeah.
And we created these care packages for, physicians and staff. And we told them, look, we have hand sanitizers, we have masks. Can you meet us in the parking lot? We are just going to take 5 minutes of your time. And we actually converted to our advantage. At a time that, they didn't even really want to see their OB patients. They were trying to get the fathers in for testing, and our test advantage is that, we can directly see the fetal DNA, so you wouldn't need the father's, sample. And we told them, look, you don't even, want the pregnant mother there, like you really want to deal with the fathers, and we converted it into our advantage. We grew above all of our even like pre-pandemic projections through that period. We have grown, from 10 tests per day to 130 tests per day within a year. And that kind of created really the company. Like that was the culture. And it wasn't easy. It was so difficult, like every single day to go through that. But it made us like much stronger. And the sales reps who went through that experience, nothing phases them anymore. They are so resilient, they are so strong that like if there is a little problem, like something happens, they're like, I can solve any problem. Like such a strong mentality now because they went through so much hardship during that time to be able to push through all of those barriers and grow us by 10x. But it was needed. Like if we didn't do those things, we wouldn't be able to survive. And again, I have like, at least 10 stories like this where, we could have said, okay, that's it. Like we couldn't, predict
And
this.
just give up. Yeah.
You could give up, or you could essentially go solve the problem. And that is the message that I give to other entrepreneurs, but as well as to our individuals in the company. In each territory, there is going to they are going to face a problem. They are going to face a challenge where they might say, okay, that's it. Like I can't solve this. This is too big of a problem. Or you can actually go to work, solve the problem, be creative, and then if they can solve the problem, it becomes a competitive advantage, right? It becomes the thing that no one else is able to do. Those providers that we converted at that time, some of them cried. Like some of them were like, this is the
Wow.
first time that I am feeling safe. That, like it was a scary time, right?
Yeah.
Being patients, you know, with no masks, like it wasn't an easy time. Everyone was afraid that that they would die. There was so much misinformation, or we didn't know how deadly COVID was early on. And they really appreciated us being there for them. They really appreciated the test as well. And even though, again, it was not easy to go through that growth, we have those providers, vast majority of them are still with us like today.
That's
Like they still
awesome.
use our test.
That's
So
awesome.
it's just you and the thing is, in some ways I think we probably grew more than what we would have grown without COVID. This is crazy to
That's
think about.
so crazy.
I think we did because there was no competition to deal with. Like there was no one left. All those large companies with huge sales forces. Sure, we have a better product, but we would still have to fight them. Clinic by clinic, test by test. Otherwise, they were nowhere to be found. They were at home. We were out there working. It wasn't easy, but it really allowed us to grow at an unprecedented rate, and it really created that core team that is so strong that many of those reps are still the highest volume reps in the country.
That's amazing. And I think too is like a testament to not only just like resilience, but it reminds me of your kind of undergraduate experience of approaching the problem from a different angle. Like the different angle. It's and I think when especially like larger organizations where there's like kind of a inertia in how they've always done things, and like especially when the org you talk to get scaled, like if your commercial team is very scaled, there's like playbooks that have been used for ages, and like you got to get like it's like kind of like moving an aircraft carrier. Like it's very hard to like get someone to do, or to get a large organization to be kind of nimble and like kind of think more kind of from like orthogonal angles. So I love hearing that, because like we even at Exceeder we feel the same way. And when I was first starting Exceeder, I was like, equipment leasing, how hard could it be? It's like this must be a simple problem. And lo and behold, hard problem. Like hard problem. And for us, and the leasing companies kind of like boil down into two major categories. You're either a part of a bank, and you're like you have very bank like qualities and you're regulated like a bank, or you're managing assets on behalf of like LPs and whatnot. When I came from the bench, so I didn't know about any of those worlds. Like I had no idea. I just had like problem getting equipment into the lab very hard. And the first problem is, oh crap, this is really expensive. Like, how am I going to like get this capital to do this? And obviously the very beginning was very, very hard, because it was like no one wants to bet on you. Like, so ultimately I had to use my life savings to get that first piece of equipment. And from there, just like one by one, like chopping wood, like that one deal led to the next deal. And we just kept doing everything internally. By the way, still did not know that leasing companies are, you can be like a bank and use like deposits or like LP capital. So he kept doing that over time. And just because I was like a scientist and did not know better, I was like, most leasing companies are not built this way. But now that's exactly what we talked about. We had this really, really hard problem, but now it's our competitive advantage. A little bit of naivete, just not knowing in the beginning that there are easier paths. We just kind of like brute forced it. We're just going to keep doing this. So now we have this like weird ability to not really be beholden to like the regulatory confines of a bank or there's obligations to your LPs. And so it started off as a really hard problem and a tough nut to crack. And it probably took a lot longer than it should have to get to scale. But exactly what you said, when you like push through those problems and you live to see what is like on the other side, you're just like, I'm undefeatable. Like, there's no problem that can faze me. And I'm sure your sales team, and I'm sure your other team too, probably in the R&D, like when you build your R&D team, we need to launch this in 3 months. And they launch it, they're like, yeah, what's next? We got something, bring it on.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast with Oguzhan Atay. Be sure to tune in for part 2, where we chat about his time at Stanford, his groundbreaking Ph.D. research, and how his work shaped the innovative approaches at BillionToOne. Oguzhan also discusses his transition from academia to entrepreneurship, the many challenges of building a biotech startup, and the vision behind his mission to transform molecular diagnostics on a global scale. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. See you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.